In the beginning, there was no witch. There was only woman who knew things others did not. In the fertile crescents of Mesopotamia, where civilization first learned to write its stories upon clay, the Babylonians and Assyrians spoke of those who could bend the invisible forces of the world to their will. These were practitioners of Kashaptu, the sacred art of binding and loosing, of calling upon the spirits that dwelt between earth and heaven. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone around 1750 BC, made mention of sorcery but treated it as a fact of life. If a man accused another of sorcery without proof, it was the accuser who faced punishment. The river itself would judge. The accused would be thrown into the sacred waters, and if they survived, their innocence would be clear. Magic could be real, could be beneficial, and false accusation was the greater crime. The Egyptians wove magic so deeply into their civilization that it became inseparable from life itself. Magic was Heka, the force by which the gods had created the world, the power that kept the sun moving across the sky, the energy that would guide the dead through the afterlife. Egyptian wise women and men were revered. They could speak words that would heal a child's fever, knew which amulets would protect travelers, understood the sacred mathematics of herbs and stones. In the great libraries of Alexandria, scrolls upon scrolls recorded their knowledge, formulas for love, for protection, for communication with the divine. When Moses stood before Rameses, demanding freedom for his people, the court magicians were summoned to match wonder with wonder, serpent with serpent. This was natural, a contest between different traditions of divine power. The Greeks began to make distinctions that would echo through the centuries. They spoke of pharmakeia, the art of potions and healing herbs, and of goetia, the summoning of spirits and the dead. But they also honored the Pythia at Delphi, that sacred oracle whose prophetic trances were sought by kings and common folk alike. Greek magic lived in the borderlands between science and mystery. Thales predicted eclipses and was called a magician for it. Empedocles understood air pressure and was credited with supernatural powers. The wise women, the pharmakides, knew the secrets of plants, could ease childbirth or guide fevers back to health. They were consulted, not condemned. Rome inherited these traditions and made them practical. The Malefica and Beneficia practiced their arts openly in the early Republic. Pliny the Elder included magical practices alongside botanical knowledge in his natural history, seeing them as different aspects of the same human quest to understand the world. Roman law distinguished between magic that helped and magic that harmed, but focused on intent and effect, not the practice itself. Throughout these civilizations, magical knowledge was closely associated with the feminine divine. In Babylon, Ishtar ruled over love and war. In Egypt, Isis was the great sorceress who had gathered the scattered pieces of Osiris and spoken the words that brought him back to life. The Greeks had Hecate, keeper of crossroads and mysteries, and Circe, whose magic could transform men into beasts. These goddesses were complex and powerful, embodying the mystery of creation and destruction, of birth and death, of the cycles that governed all life. Their earthly servants carried the same complex power. They were midwives who could ease birth or prevent it, healers who could cure or poison, seers who could reveal or hide the future. They held essential knowledge, how to make difficult labor easier, which herbs would prevent conception, what rituals would ensure good harvest. This was dangerous knowledge, but it was sacred knowledge, carefully guarded and responsibly shared. These women were respected for their wisdom, feared perhaps for their power, but not hunted. As Christianity spread across the Mediterranean world, the old ways adapted and survived. In the forests of Germania, the Celtic lands, the wild reaches of Scandinavia, ancient practices continued. The Celtic druids were scholars and judges, as well as magical practitioners. The Germanic vulva were seers whose counsel was sought by warriors and kings. The Slavic wise women knew the secrets of herbs and stones, of birth and death, of the thin places where the spirit world touched the physical realm. These traditions were old beyond memory, passed down from mother to daughter, preserved in songs and stories that predated the written word. When Christian missionaries began their work among these peoples, they often found allies rather than enemies. The wise women and cunning men understood healing and herbs, knowledge that could serve the new faith as well as the old. Many early saints were themselves practitioners of what would later be called magic. Saint Bridget of Ireland was associated with sacred flames and healing wells. St. Patrick was said to have driven out the serpents, perhaps describing his conquest of the old snake-worshipping traditions. The early church was remarkably tolerant of such practices. What mattered was the end, not the means. If a Christian woman could heal with herbs and prayers, if a converted wise man could predict weather and give good counsel, these were gifts from God to be celebrated. But the seeds of future persecution were being planted. In Scripture, troubling passages appeared. The witch of Endor, who had summoned the spirit of Samuel for King Saul, was presented as a figure of darkness. The injunction, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," stood in the book of Exodus, though its context would be debated for centuries. As Christianity evolved from persecuted sect to official religion of empire, its relationship with magic grew more dangerous. The Church Fathers began developing the theological framework that would eventually criminalize practices that had been part of human culture since its beginning. Augustine wrote extensively about magic in his City of God. He did not deny that magical effects could be real, but argued they came from demons rather than God. This was crucial. Magic was not simply ineffective superstition, it was actively evil, a form of devil worship, whether the practitioner realized it or not. Thomas Aquinas would develop this idea further centuries later. In his Summa Theologica, he created a systematic theology that left little room for beneficial magic. All supernatural effects that did not come directly from God must come from Satan. There could be no neutral middle ground, no ancient wisdom outside the Christian framework. Yet even as these ideas took root in scholarly minds, common people continued their old practices. Village wise women still helped with difficult births. Cunning men still found lost cattle and predicted weather. Herb wives still brewed healing potions and sold them at market fairs. The gap between official doctrine and lived reality remained vast. By the close of the first millennium after Christ, magic had not yet become crime. Folk practices continued alongside Christian devotion. The wise woman and parish priest often worked together, combining ancient herbal knowledge with Christian prayers, mixing pagan healing traditions with the new faith's emphasis on divine mercy. In the monasteries and cathedral schools, scholars were developing ideas that would prove deadly. In the legal codes of emerging nations, new definitions of crime and heresy were taking shape. The wise women and cunning folk could not have known what was coming. They continued their ancient work, helping where they could, healing what could be healed, standing at the end of one age and the beginning of another. The forces that would transform magic from mystery into heresy, that would make the wise woman into the witch, were already stirring. The medieval world was about to discover what human beings were capable of when fear was given official sanction and legal authority. The medieval world was about to discover what human beings were capable of when fear was given official sanction and legal authority. That discovery would begin not with witches, but with heretics. The machinery of persecution needed practice before it could perfect its deadly art. In the sun-drenched hills of southern France, where troubadours sang of courtly love and merchants grew rich on Mediterranean trade, lived a people who would become Christianity's first great internal enemy. The Cathars believed in two gods, one of light and spirit, one of darkness and flesh. They saw the material world as evil, created by Satan, and sought to escape it through rigorous purification. They rejected the Catholic Church's authority, its sacraments, its claims to be the sole path to salvation. To the Cathars, the Church itself was corrupt, worldly, satanic. They called the Pope the Antichrist and refused to swear oaths, pay tithes, or acknowledge any earthly authority in matters of the soul. Their perfecti lived lives of extreme asceticism, renouncing all worldly pleasures, while their believers lived normal lives until their final deathbed ritual, the consolamentum, which would purify them for the next world. Pope Innocent III watched this heresy spread through Languedoc with growing alarm. Here was a challenge to everything the Church represented, its authority, its wealth, its very reason for existence. In 1208, after his papal legate was murdered, possibly by a Cathar sympathizer, Innocent declared a crusade. But this would not be a crusade against distant Muslims in the Holy Land. This would be a crusade against Christians in Christian lands. The Albigensian Crusade, as it came to be known, would rage for 20 years. Northern French nobles, led by Simon de Montfort, descended on the prosperous south with papal blessing and the promise of plenary indulgences. At Béziers in 1209, when the Crusaders asked how to distinguish Catholics from Cathars among the city's population, the papal legate reportedly replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." 20,000 people died that day. The slaughter at Béziers established a pattern that would echo through the centuries. When faced with the difficulty of identifying enemies who looked, spoke, and lived like everyone else, the solution was simple: kill everyone and let God sort them out. Suspicion became sufficient. Accusation became proof. The burden of proving innocence fell on the accused, an impossible task when the crime was belief itself. But the Albigensian Crusade did more than perfect the techniques of mass murder. It created the institutional framework for systematic persecution. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX established the medieval Inquisition, a permanent judicial body tasked with rooting out heresy wherever it might hide. Unlike local bishops, who might be lenient or corrupt, the inquisitors answered directly to Rome. They had authority that transcended local law, local custom, local mercy. The Inquisition's methods were revolutionary in their efficiency. They would arrive in a town and announce a period of grace, confess your heresy voluntarily, denounce your neighbors, and receive only light penance. When the grace period ended, the real work began. Anonymous accusations were encouraged. Torture was permitted to extract confessions. Property was confiscated to fund the proceedings. Those who confessed might live, though they would be ruined. Those who maintained their innocence faced the flames. The inquisitors developed questionnaires designed to trap the unwary. They asked about beliefs, about practices, about neighbors and friends. They created files and records, tracking bloodlines and associations across generations. They turned communities against themselves, making every citizen a potential informer, every conversation a potential trap. This machinery, created to destroy the Cathars, would prove adaptable to other threats. When the last Cathar perfect was burned at Montségur in 1244, the Inquisition did not disband. It found new enemies, new heresies, new reasons to exist. It had learned too much to simply disappear. The next great target would be even more shocking in its audacity. The Knights Templar had been among Christendom's most revered warriors, the holy knights who had fought and died for the faith in the Holy Land. For 2 centuries, they had enjoyed papal protection, royal favour, and the donations of the faithful. They had become rich, powerful, and perhaps too independent for their own good. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, faced financial crisis. His wars with England had drained the royal treasury, and the Templars' wealth was tempting beyond endurance. But how to seize it without appearing to rob the Church's own warriors? The solution was elegant in its cynicism: accuse them of the very heresies the Inquisition had been created to combat. On Friday, October the 13th, 1307, every Templar in France was simultaneously arrested on charges that would have seemed incredible just a generation earlier. They were accused of denying Christ, spitting on the crucifix, worshipping a demonic head called Baphomet, engaging in homosexual acts, and practicing magic. The accusations were specific, detailed, and almost certainly fabricated. But the Inquisition's methods had been perfected over decades of practice. Under torture, many Templars confessed to whatever their interrogators demanded. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master himself, confessed under torture, recanted when the torture stopped, then confessed again when it resumed. The pattern repeated across Europe as other rulers, seeing an opportunity, followed Philip's lead. The Templar trials established crucial precedents for what would come. They showed that no one was too powerful, too holy, or too respected to escape accusation. They demonstrated that even the most outlandish charges could be made to stick if backed by sufficient authority. They proved that torture could extract any confession, create any narrative, justify any outcome. Most importantly, the Templar trials introduced specific elements that would later become central to witch persecution: the worship of demons, the rejection of Christ, the practice of perverted rituals, the corruption of others through seduction or force. All these themes appeared in the Templar accusations. The inquisitors were learning the vocabulary of supernatural crime. When the last Grand Master burned in Paris in 1314, the Inquisition had gained invaluable experience in destroying organized groups accused of secret, heretical practices. The techniques developed against Cathars and refined against Templars would need only minor modification to be turned against an even more vulnerable target: the wise women and cunning folk, whose ancient knowledge was becoming increasingly suspicious to Christian authorities. The transformation was already underway in the minds of theologians. Augustine's old arguments about demonic magic were being refined and systematized. The great scholastic philosophers were constructing elaborate theories about how Satan worked in the world, how demons could influence human affairs, how evil could masquerade as good. In 1398, the theological faculty of the University of Paris condemned 28 articles related to magic and superstition. They declared that all magical effects not performed through divine power must necessarily come from demons. They denied that there could be any neutral magic, any beneficial sorcery, any healing that did not depend entirely on God's grace. This was the crucial shift that the ancient world had never made. For the Greeks and Romans, for the Egyptians and Babylonians, magic had been a natural force that could be used for good or ill, like fire or water. But Christian theology was constructing a universe with no middle ground. Everything supernatural was either divine or diabolic. There could be no ancient wisdom, no folk knowledge, no women's mysteries that stood outside this stark dichotomy. The persecution of Joan of Arc in 1431 would show how these new ideas could be weaponized against individuals. Joan was not a Cathar or a Templar. She was a peasant girl who claimed to hear voices from heaven, who had convinced the French court that God wanted her to drive the English from France. Her military successes had made her famous. Her capture by English allies had made her vulnerable, and her claims of divine inspiration had made her dangerous. The English could not simply execute a prisoner of war who had become a symbol of French resistance, but they could try her for heresy, for witchcraft, for the crime of claiming direct communication with God without church mediation. Her judges were learned men, bishops, and doctors of theology, who understood that Joan's greatest crime was not military, but spiritual. She claimed an authority that bypassed their own. The charges against Joan were carefully crafted to destroy not just her body, but her reputation. She was accused of consorting with demons, of practicing witchcraft, of wearing men's clothing in defiance of divine law. Her voices, which she claimed came from Saints Michael, Margaret, and Catherine, were declared to be demonic deceptions. Her military successes were attributed not to divine favor, but to satanic assistance. Joan's trial revealed how the Inquisition's methods could be adapted to destroy anyone who threatened established authority. Her judges used leading questions designed to trap her in contradictions. They twisted her words, challenged her faith, demanded that she submit absolutely to church authority, while simultaneously accusing her of heresy for doing precisely what the church itself claimed to do: receive divine revelation. When Joan finally broke under pressure and signed a confession, her judges commuted her death sentence to life imprisonment. But when she recanted her confession and resumed wearing men's clothing, perhaps the only clothes available in her cell, she was declared a relapsed heretic and burned at the stake. Her death established that even recantation could not guarantee safety. The machinery of persecution had become too hungry, too profitable, too useful to those in power to be easily satisfied. The pattern was now complete. The Cathars had provided the motivation, the need to destroy organized heresy. The Templars had provided the methods, how to bring down the powerful through accusations of secret, diabolic practices. Joan of Arc had provided the model, how to destroy individuals whose only crime was claiming authority that threatened the established order. All that remained was to find a target numerous enough to keep the machinery busy, vulnerable enough to offer little resistance, and profitable enough to justify the expense. The wise women and cunning folk of Europe, with their ancient knowledge and their lack of institutional protection, would prove perfect for the role. The machinery of persecution was ready. The theological justification was complete. The legal precedents were established. The church had learned to weaponize fear, and the state had learned to profit from persecution. The only question remaining was when the hunt would begin in earnest. The answer would come in the late 15th century, when all these elements would finally converge in a document that would make sorcery not just a transgression, but an obsession. The hammer was about to fall, and it would be wielded by two Dominican inquisitors who believed they had discovered the greatest threat Christianity had ever faced. Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger had spent years investigating reports of diabolic arts in the German territories. What they found, or claimed to find, horrified them. Female suspects were making pacts with the devil, they reported. They were flying through the night to attend demonic assemblies called sabbats. They were killing babies, spoiling crops, causing impotence in men and sterility in women. They were practicing maleficium on a scale that threatened the very fabric of Christian society. But when Kramer and Sprenger tried to prosecute these cases, they encountered resistance. Local authorities questioned their evidence. Bishops challenged their methods. Even some fellow inquisitors expressed doubt about the reality of the threats they described. The problem was not a lack of laws against spellcraft. Those had existed for centuries. The problem was a lack of conviction that such occult practices represented an urgent, widespread danger requiring immediate and drastic action. The solution came from the highest authority in Christendom. On December 5th, 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued the bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, desiring with supreme ardor. The document was brief, barely a few hundred words, but its impact would be measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. The bull declared that the diabolical arts were real, their offenses were genuine, and their threat to Christian society was imminent. It specifically named the German territories as infected regions where many persons of both sexes, unmindful of their own salvation and straying from the Catholic faith, have abandoned themselves to devils, incubi, and succubi. These spell workers, the Pope declared, were causing harm to people, animals, and crops through their sorceries, spells, conjurations, and other accursed charms and crafts, enormities, and horrid offences. More crucially, Summis Desiderantes gave Kramer and Sprenger explicit papal authority to investigate, prosecute, and punish these practices throughout the German territories. Local authorities, who had previously resisted or obstructed their work, were now commanded to assist them. Any interference with their investigations would be considered interference with the Pope's direct orders. But Innocent VIII's bull was only the beginning. Kramer and Sprenger understood that papal authority alone would not be enough to convince skeptical judges, reluctant bishops, and doubting authorities. They needed something more comprehensive, more persuasive, more systematically terrifying. They needed a manual that would explain not just that the diabolic arts existed, but how to identify their practitioners, how to prosecute them, and why every Christian had a duty to hunt them down. In 1487, 3 years after the papal bull, they published the Hammer, the treatise known formally as the Malleus Maleficarum. The timing was perfect. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press had been in operation for barely 30 years, but already it was revolutionizing the spread of ideas. The manual would become one of the first bestsellers of the printing age, reprinted dozens of times and translated into multiple languages. The Hammer was structured as a comprehensive guide to maleficium in 3 parts. The first proved that such practitioners existed and that denying their existence was itself heretical. The second explained their methods, how they made pacts with demons, how they attended Sabbats, how they caused harm through occult practices. The third provided detailed instructions for their prosecution, how to identify suspects, how to extract confessions, how to overcome legal obstacles that might protect the accused. What made the manual so powerful was not just its papal imprimatur, but its appearance of scholarly rigor. Kramer and Sprenger cited classical authorities, quoted biblical passages, referenced legal precedents, and provided case studies from their own investigations. They created a systematic demonology that explained how the devil operated in the world and why he chose to work primarily through women. The question of why female suspects were more susceptible to the occult received extensive treatment in the manual. The authors argued that women were naturally weaker in faith, more carnal in their desires, more credulous and impressionable than men. They were more prone to extremes. When good, they could be very good, but when evil, they surpassed men in wickedness. Their very name, femina, was said to derive from phi minus, less faith. Women's sexuality was particularly dangerous, the manual claimed. The devil used sexual temptation to ensnare them, offering pleasures that their weak natures could not resist. Once corrupted, these village widows became active agents of evil, seducing others into the devil's service. The stereotypical magic worker began to take shape, an older woman, often widowed, living on the margins of society, practicing folk medicine or midwifery, possessing knowledge that seemed inexplicable to her neighbors. The hammer also provided detailed instructions for conducting trials. It explained how to overcome legal protections that might shield the accused. Normal rules of evidence could be relaxed, it argued, because maleficium was a crime in exceptum, an exceptional offense that threatened the very foundations of society. Anonymous accusations should be accepted because witnesses might fear occult retaliation. Torture was not only permitted but recommended, because demons would help their servants resist ordinary questioning. The manual even addressed practical concerns that might arise during investigations. How should judges protect themselves from otherworldly attack? What prayers and rituals would shield them from demonic influence? How could they distinguish between genuine, preternatural phenomena and clever trickery? The hammer anticipated every possible objection and provided authoritative answers. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the treatise was how it turned normal human experiences into evidence of spellcraft. Did crops fail? A midwife had cursed them. Did animals sicken? A village healer had cast spells. Did babies die in infancy? A wise woman had sacrificed them to demons. Did men experience impotence? A suspect had stolen their virility. The manual created a worldview in which every misfortune could be traced to occult malice, and every instance of occult malice pointed toward the local midwife. The printing press ensured that these ideas spread far beyond the German territories, where Kramer and Sprenger had first encountered them. Copies of the hammer reached France, Italy, Spain, England, and eventually the New World. With each reprinting, the manual's authority grew. Local judges who might have dismissed accusations as superstition found themselves confronted with papal bulls and scholarly treatises that insisted such transgressions were real and required immediate action. The transformation was remarkable in its speed and scope. In 1400, most European authorities treated accusations of diabolic arts with skepticism. Local wise women and cunning folk practiced their trades with little interference beyond occasional warnings from parish priests. Folk magic and Christian devotion coexisted much as they had for centuries. By 1500, everything had changed. Spellcraft had become not just a forbidden act, but an obsession. Entire regions lived in fear of uncanny attack. Communities turned against their own members, searching for hidden enemies who might be responsible for any misfortune. The midwives who had once been consulted in times of need became the first suspects when needs went unmet. The case of Gilles de Rais, tried and executed in 1440, had provided an early template for linking occult offences to horrific violence. Rais, a nobleman and former companion of Joan of Arc, was accused of murdering hundreds of children in satanic rituals. Whether the charges were true or false, historians still debate the question. His trial established the association between sorcery and the most heinous transgressions imaginable. The hammer would build on this foundation, arguing that all magic workers were potential child killers, that their seemingly innocent healing practices were covers for murder and cannibalism. The printing press did more than spread the treatise itself. It created an entire literature of persecution. as local authorities published accounts of their own trials and investigations. These pamphlets, broadsides, and books served multiple purposes. They educated other judges about proper procedures. They entertained readers with lurid details of uncanny offences. Most importantly, they created a feedback loop of validation. Each published account seemed to confirm the reality of the threat described in others. The confession of one accused healer, extracted under torture in Germany, might be cited as evidence in a trial in France. The testimony of witnesses in England might influence proceedings in Scotland. The hammer had created not just a manual for persecution, but a shared vocabulary of arcane wrongdoing that transcended local boundaries and legal traditions. Wise women became the primary targets of this new machinery, not by accident, but by design. The village healers and midwives who had served their communities for generations possessed exactly the kind of knowledge that the hammer declared most dangerous. They understood herbs and potions. They dealt with birth and death. They practiced rituals and spoke words that seemed to influence events in mysterious ways. Under the new paradigm, these were not skills, but crimes, not wisdom, but maleficium. The midwife who helped a woman through difficult labor could be accused of causing the difficulties in the first place. The herb woman who brewed remedies for common ailments could be charged with brewing poisons. The wise woman who predicted weather or found lost objects could be condemned for consorting with demons. The very knowledge that had once made them valuable to their communities now made them vulnerable to destruction. The manual had created a perfect trap. It defined sorcery so broadly that almost any woman could be accused, yet provided such detailed evidence that guilt seemed obvious once charges were filed. It made denial of maleficium itself heretical, ensuring that even skeptical authorities would be reluctant to challenge accusations too vigorously. It turned communities into surveillance networks where neighbors watched neighbors for signs of preternatural offense. By the early 16th century, the foundations were complete. The theological framework existed to justify persecution. The legal mechanisms existed to carry it out. The popular literature existed to spread fear and suspicion. The institutional machinery existed to process accusations and extract confessions. All that remained was for the right combination of circumstances to trigger the great hunts that would consume Europe for the next 2 centuries. Those circumstances were already forming. Religious warfare between Catholics and Protestants would create uncertainty and paranoia. Economic disruption would leave communities searching for scapegoats. Climate change would bring harsh winters and failed harvests that required explanation. Political instability would make authorities eager to demonstrate their vigilance against hidden enemies. The hammer had fallen. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. Those circumstances were already forming in the cold, uncertain world of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. What followed would be 2 centuries of terror that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives and transformed the very meaning of fear in European society. The timing was not coincidental. Europe in 1500 was a continent in crisis. The medieval world was dying, but what would replace it remained unclear. The Protestant Reformation had shattered religious unity, creating competing versions of Christian truth that viewed each other as heretical. The Little Ice Age had begun, bringing harsh winters, failed harvests, and desperate populations searching for someone to blame. Political authority was fragmenting as old feudal structures gave way to emerging nation-states that needed to prove their power. Into this chaos came the witch hunters, offering simple explanations for complex problems. Crops failed because witches cursed them. Children died because witches sacrificed them. Livestock sickened because witches cast spells. Wars raged because witches served enemy powers. Every misfortune had a face, every catastrophe had a cause, and every cause could be eliminated if authorities had the will to act. The German territories, fragmented into hundreds of competing jurisdictions, became the epicenter of the persecution. Here, the Holy Roman Empire's weakness created a power vacuum that local princes and bishops rushed to fill. Demonstrating zeal against witchcraft became a way to prove religious orthodoxy and political authority simultaneously. The very fragmentation that made Germany ungovernable made it perfect hunting ground for those who sought to make their reputations in witches' blood. Julius Ector, Prince Bishop of Würzburg, understood this dynamic perfectly. When he took power in 1573, his territory was economically struggling and religiously divided. The Counter-Reformation demanded that Catholic territories prove their devotion by purging Protestant influences, but Ector found an even more dramatic solution. He would purge the witches whose supernatural crimes threatened all Christians, Catholic and Protestant alike. Under Ector's direction, Würzburg became a laboratory of persecution. His courts developed new techniques for identifying witches, new methods for extracting confessions, new systems for processing the accused efficiently. Between 1626 and 1631, over 600 people were burned in Würzburg alone. The smoke from the pyres became so constant that visitors reported the city smelled perpetually of charred flesh. Ector's methods were copied by his neighbour, Gottfried Johann Georg Fuchs Dornheim, Prince Bishop of Bamberg. Dornheim went even further, establishing a specialized court devoted entirely to witch trials. He built a special prison called the Malefizhaus, the Evil House, designed specifically for holding and torturing accused witches. Between 1626 and 1631, over 1,000 people died in Bamberg's flames. These were not random persecutions driven by popular hysteria. They were systematic campaigns organized by educated authorities who understood exactly what they were doing. The prince-bishops kept careful records, maintained detailed procedures, and created administrative systems that could process accusations efficiently. They turned persecution into a science, suffering into a bureaucracy. The pattern spread across Germany like fire in dry wood. In Trier, another prince-bishop named Peter Binsfeld orchestrated trials that killed over 1,000 people. The persecution was so thorough that entire villages were left nearly empty, their populations either burned or fled. In some communities, only 1 or 2 women of childbearing age survived. The demographic impact would be felt for generations. But Germany was only the beginning. The Counter-Reformation carried the witch-hunting fervor into other Catholic territories. France, despite its stronger central authority, experienced devastating outbreaks of persecution. The Parliament of Paris eventually tried to restrain the trials, but regional courts continued the hunts. Between 1580 and 1650, thousands died in French fires. Switzerland, despite its reputation for sober practicality, proved equally susceptible to the mania. The mountainous terrain and isolated communities provided perfect conditions for accusations to flourish. Neighbors who had nursed grievances for years found new ways to settle old scores. The wise women who had helped communities survive harsh alpine winters became the scapegoats for those same winters' worst effects. The hunts crossed religious boundaries with disturbing ease. Protestant territories proved just as eager to burn witches as Catholic ones. The Reformation had not eliminated belief in supernatural evil. It had merely changed the authorities responsible for combating it. Lutheran and Calvinist ministers proved as zealous as Catholic inquisitors. in identifying and destroying the devil's servants. Scotland, newly Protestant and fiercely independent, created its own unique contribution to the persecution. King James VI, later James I of England, became personally obsessed with witchcraft after experiencing what he believed was supernatural attack. In 1590, storms delayed his return from Denmark with his new bride. Investigations revealed a conspiracy of witches who had allegedly raised the storms to prevent the royal marriage. The North Berwick witch trials that followed established James as one of Europe's most enthusiastic witch hunters. He personally attended interrogations, suggested new tortures, and even published a treatise on witchcraft called Demonology. When he inherited the English throne in 1603, he brought his obsessions south with him. England had been relatively restrained in its approach to witchcraft until James's arrival. The English legal system's protections for the accused, combined with skeptical attitudes among educated elites, had limited the scope of persecution. But James's influence, combined with growing Puritan pressure for moral reform, created new opportunities for accusers. The Pendle witch trials of 1612 would become England's most famous witch hunt, though far from its largest. In the remote hills of Lancashire, two families, the Devices and the Whittles, found themselves at the centre of accusations that spiralled out of control. What began as neighbourly disputes over theft and trespass became a supernatural conspiracy involving 12 defendants, 10 of whom were executed. The Pendle trials were notable not for their size, but for their documentation. The investigating magistrate, Roger Nowell, kept detailed records that survived to provide historians with an unusually complete picture of how witch accusations developed. The documents reveal the personal animosities, economic pressures, and family conflicts that lay beneath the supernatural charges. They also reveal how the new legal procedures favoured accusers over the accused. Spectral evidence, testimony about what witnesses claimed to see in dreams or visions, was accepted as proof of supernatural crime. Children's testimony was given equal weight with adults. Leading questions guided witnesses toward the answers prosecutors wanted. The accused found themselves defending not just against specific charges, but against the entire weight of popular belief in witchcraft's reality. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the witch hunts took on characteristics shaped by the region's unique culture and geography. Norway and Sweden, with their long traditions of folk magic and shamanic practices, provided rich hunting grounds for authorities seeking evidence of supernatural crime. The vulva and wise women who had served these communities for centuries found their ancient knowledge redefined as diabolic conspiracy. The Finnmark witch trials in northern Norway became particularly notorious for their targeting of the indigenous Sami population. The Sami's traditional spiritual practices, including drumming, trance states, and communication with spirits, were easily reinterpreted as witchcraft by Christian authorities. Between 1600 and 1695, over 90 Sami were executed for witchcraft, a devastating blow to a small population. Denmark developed its own distinctive contribution to witch-hunting literature, with the publication of detailed trial records and confessions. These documents, translated and circulated throughout Europe, provided other prosecutors with templates for their own investigations. The standardization of witch trial procedures across different countries was aided significantly by this international exchange of information. The economic dimensions of the witch hunts became increasingly apparent as the persecutions intensified. In many jurisdictions, the property of convicted witches was confiscated to pay for the costs of their trials and executions. This created perverse incentives for authorities to target wealthy defendants, whose assets could fund further prosecutions. Widows who had inherited property were particularly vulnerable, as were successful merchants whose prosperity might seem suspicious to struggling neighbors. The trials themselves became profitable enterprises. Professional witch-finders emerged who charged fees for their services in identifying supernatural criminals. Torture devices were manufactured and sold to courts that wanted to extract more effective confessions. Executioners commanded premium prices for their expertise in dispatching large numbers of condemned witches efficiently. The clergy found new roles as experts in supernatural crime. Parish priests became investigators, collecting gossip and accusations from their parishioners. Bishops became judges, pronouncing on the guilt or innocence of the accused. Theologians became authorities, explaining how diabolic magic operated and why it threatened Christian society. The church, which had once provided sanctuary for the accused, became the institution most responsible for their destruction. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the great European witch hunts was how they transformed communities into surveillance networks. Neighbors watched neighbors for signs of supernatural crime. Children denounced parents, wives accused husbands, friends betrayed friends. The social bonds that held communities together were systematically destroyed by suspicion and fear. The accused found themselves in impossible situations. Confession meant death, but might spare family members from suspicion. Denial meant more torture and eventual execution anyway. Naming accomplices might save one's own life, but condemned others to the flames. The witch trials created moral dilemmas that had no good solutions, choices that destroyed souls even before they destroyed bodies. As the 17th century progressed, the machinery of persecution reached industrial efficiency. Courts processed dozens of cases simultaneously. Execution sites operated continuously during peak hunting seasons. Record-keeping systems tracked accusations, confessions, and property seizures with bureaucratic precision. The witch hunt had become a permanent feature of European life, as regular and predictable as the harvest seasons. Yet even at the height of the persecution, voices of doubt were beginning to emerge. A few brave individuals started questioning whether the confessions extracted under torture were reliable, whether the evidence of supernatural crime was sufficient, whether the cost in human lives was justified by the threat being combated. These early skeptics would face accusations of witchcraft themselves, but their courage would eventually help bring the great hunts to an end. For now, however, the fires burned across Europe with terrifying regularity. Yet even at the height of the terror, voices of doubt were beginning to emerge. A few brave individuals started questioning whether the confessions extracted under torture were reliable, whether the evidence of occult crime was sufficient, whether the cost in human lives was justified by the threat being combated. These early skeptics would face charges of maleficium themselves, but their courage would eventually help bring the great purges to an end. The first major challenge to the spell-hunting orthodoxy came from an unexpected source, an English country gentleman named Reginald Scot. In 1584, Scot published The Discovery of Witchcraft, a systematic demolition of the beliefs that underpinned the crackdown. Scot was not a radical or a heretic. He was a conservative Protestant who believed deeply in God's power and the devil's reality. But he also believed that most of what passed for the diabolic arts was either natural phenomena misunderstood or deliberate fraud designed to deceive the gullible. Scott's approach was methodical and devastating. He examined the classical sources that prosecutors cited, showing how they had been misinterpreted or taken out of context. He analyzed the confessions extracted under torture, demonstrating how leading questions and physical agony could produce any narrative prosecutors desired. He investigated the supposed magical effects attributed to occult practitioners, revealing natural explanations for most phenomena, and suggesting that the remainder were simple tricks performed by con artists. Most dangerously, Scott challenged the theological foundations of the campaign. If God was truly omnipotent, he argued, why would he permit the devil to grant real supernatural powers to human beings? Would this not make Satan a rival deity, capable of miraculous works that rivaled God's own? The logic was uncomfortable but compelling. Either these individuals possessed no real powers, or God was not truly supreme. The discovery of witchcraft was immediately controversial. King James VI of Scotland was so offended by the book that he wrote his own treatise, Demonology, partly as a direct response to Scott's arguments. James ordered copies of Scott's book burned when he became King of England. But the ideas had already spread too widely to be suppressed entirely. Scott's skepticism found echoes in other parts of Europe, though often expressed more cautiously. In the Netherlands, a Dutch Reformed minister named Balthazar Bekker published The Enchanted World in 1691, arguing that the devil's power over the physical world was far more limited than prosecutors claimed. Bekker did not deny the existence of evil spirits, but he questioned whether they could actually perform the dramatic effects attributed to them in spellcraft proceedings. Becker's work was translated into multiple languages and sparked fierce debates throughout Protestant Europe. Conservative clergy denounced him as a dangerous skeptic who undermined faith in Scripture. Progressive intellectuals praised him as a voice of reason in an age of superstition. The controversy revealed how deeply divided European intellectual life had become on questions of otherworldly belief. But perhaps the most influential skeptical voice came from within the Catholic Church itself. Friedrich Spee was a Jesuit priest who had served as confessor to condemned defendants in the German territories during the height of the purges. What Spee witnessed in the torture chambers and execution grounds of Würzburg and Bamberg changed him forever. Spee had entered his confessorial duties, believing in the reality of diabolic conspiracies and the necessity of the prosecutions. He expected to encounter evil women who had sold their souls to Satan for arcane power. Instead, he found terrified innocents whose only crime was falling under suspicion in communities consumed by fear and hatred. Spee watched as torture was used not to extract truth, but to create it. He saw how inquisitors shaped confessions through leading questions and selective recording. He observed how the threat of further torture could make anyone admit to anything. Most disturbing of all, he witnessed how the process corrupted everyone involved, not just the accused, but the judges, the torturers, the witnesses, and even the clergy who blessed the proceedings. In 1631, Spee published Cautio Criminalis, a warning about criminal trials, anonymously for fear of retaliation. The book was a devastating indictment of prosecution procedures, written by someone who had observed them from the inside. Spee argued that the legal safeguards designed to protect the innocent had been systematically dismantled in these cases, creating a judicial process that could condemn anyone unfortunate enough to be charged. Spee's most powerful argument was practical rather than theological. If prosecution procedures were reliable, he asked, why did they consistently produce confessions from the innocent as well as the guilty? If torture revealed truth, why did the tortured confess to obvious impossibilities? If the devil's mark could be reliably identified, why did different experts disagree about what constituted such evidence? The Jesuits' questions cut to the heart of the crackdown. Spee suggested that the very procedures designed to combat arcane evil had become evil themselves, destroying innocent lives in pursuit of imaginary transgressions. He called for fundamental reforms in legal procedure and a return to traditional standards of evidence that required proof beyond mere allegation and confession. Spee's work was particularly influential because of his unimpeachable credentials as a Catholic priest and his direct experience with the inquests. He could not be dismissed as a Protestant heretic or an ignorant outsider. His arguments forced even committed spell hunters to confront uncomfortable questions about their methods and their results. The emergence of systematic skepticism coincided with a bizarre case that would become one of the most famous examples of mass hysteria in European history. In 1634, the French town of Loudun was convulsed by claims that an entire convent of Ursuline nuns had been possessed by demons sent by a local priest named Urbain Grandier. The Loudun possessions had all the elements of classic occult prosecution: preternatural phenomena, sexual allegations, political intrigue, and religious controversy. The nuns writhed in apparent agony, spoke in tongues, demonstrated uncanny knowledge, and charged Grandier with bewitching them through diabolic magic. Medical experts were divided about whether the symptoms were genuine or feigned. Church authorities were uncertain whether they were witnessing divine trial or demonic deception. The case became a sensation throughout Europe as detailed accounts circulated in pamphlets and books. Skeptics pointed to the obvious political motivations behind the allegations. Grandier had made powerful enemies through his opposition to Cardinal Richelieu's policies. Believers saw confirmation of their worst fears about the spread of occult practice into the very heart of religious institutions. Grandier was eventually executed, but the possessions continued, suggesting that eliminating the supposed malefactor had not solved the underlying problem. The case became a powerful argument for skeptical voices who questioned whether otherworldly explanations were necessary for phenomena that might have psychological or political causes. The Loudun affair also revealed how arcane charges could be manufactured for purely secular purposes. Grandier's real offense was political opposition, not sorcery. The possession symptoms provided a convenient pretext for eliminating an inconvenient enemy while avoiding accusations of political persecution. The case showed how these prosecutions could serve as weapons in conflicts that had nothing to do with religion or magic. Meanwhile, in Italy, a very different pattern was emerging. The Papal Inquisition, perhaps surprisingly, proved more restrained in its approach to arcane matters than many secular courts. Italian inquisitors were generally better educated, more procedurally careful, and more skeptical of allegations than their northern European counterparts. Italy, the heartland of Catholic Christianity, experienced far fewer executions than Protestant England or Germany. This paradox puzzled contemporary observers and continues to intrigue historians. Several factors may explain Italy's restraint. The Mediterranean tradition of folk magic was so deeply embedded in popular culture that it could not be easily eliminated without destroying entire communities. The Roman legal tradition emphasized careful procedure and strong evidence. The presence of the papal court created pressure for theological sophistication that discouraged crude crackdowns. Most importantly, Italian authorities seemed to understand instinctively what Northern Europeans learned only through bitter experience: that prosecutions could easily spiral out of control, destroying social order rather than preserving it. The restraint shown by Italian courts may have reflected practical wisdom rather than skeptical philosophy. Eastern Europe presented yet another pattern. In Poland, Hungary, and other regions, arcane beliefs blended with vampire mythology to create unique forms of supernatural fear. But even here, the great spellcraft purges of Western Europe found only limited echo. Orthodox Christianity's different theological traditions, combined with political structures that emphasized local autonomy, created barriers to systematic terror. Russia, in particular, remained largely immune to the hysteria that consumed its Western neighbors. The Orthodox Church's approach to folk magic was more tolerant, incorporating many traditional practices rather than condemning them outright. Russian authorities were more concerned with political rebellion than with arcane crime, and their legal traditions did not easily accommodate the procedural innovations that made Western prosecutions so deadly. These regional variations suggested that the Great Crackdown was not an inevitable response to universal human fears, but a specific historical phenomenon shaped by particular combinations of religious, legal, and political factors. The fact that some regions largely escaped the purge, while others were devastated by it, provided powerful evidence for skeptics who argued that the campaign reflected human weakness rather than genuine threat. By the middle of the 17th century, the accumulated weight of skeptical argument was beginning to tell. Legal scholars were calling for procedural reforms. Medical experts were offering natural explanations for supposed preternatural phenomena. Even some clergy were questioning whether the costs of the campaign outweighed its benefits. The skeptics faced enormous obstacles. They were challenging not just popular beliefs, but institutional interests that had grown powerful through the terror. Prosecutors had built careers on their expertise in arcane crime. Courts had become dependent on confiscated property to fund their operations. Communities had invested so much in the reality of the threat that admitting error seemed impossible. Yet the voices of reason persisted, growing stronger and more confident with each passing year. They offered alternative explanations for the phenomena that had terrified Europe for centuries. They demonstrated the unreliability of evidence that had seemed conclusive. Most importantly, they showed that societies could function perfectly well without constant vigilance against otherworldly enemies. The battle between skepticism and credulity would continue for decades, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Reason had found its voice in the darkness, and that voice was growing too strong to be silenced by the flames. The most disturbing aspect of the witch hunts was not their scale or their brutality, but their systematic targeting of females. The statistics are stark and undeniable. Between 75 and 85% of those executed for maleficium were female. This was not coincidence or accident. It was the logical result of beliefs, institutions, and social structures that made them particularly vulnerable to accusations of supernatural crime. The Malleus Maleficarum had established the theological framework that made females the primary targets of persecutors. Its authors argued that they were naturally more susceptible to diabolic temptation because of their inferior spiritual nature. They were more credulous, more carnal, more emotional than men. Their very biology made them unreliable. They were subject to monthly cycles that affected their judgment. They experienced childbirth and menopause in ways that seemed to connect them to mysterious natural forces. But the Malleus went beyond simple misogyny to create a systematic theory of feminine evil. Female sexuality was particularly dangerous because it could be used to corrupt men. A person who made a pact with the devil did not simply damn herself. She became an active agent of recruitment, using her sexual power to draw others into Satan's service. The seductive spell worker became a standard figure in trial testimony, described in lurid detail that revealed as much about male fears as arcane crimes. The stereotype of the malefactor crystallized around the figure of the older, independent person living on the margins of society. She was typically widowed, which meant she lacked male protection and supervision. She was often poor, which made her dependent on charity and prone to resentment when help was refused. She was frequently involved in traditional domestic occupations, brewing, healing, midwifery, herb gathering, that required knowledge that seemed mysterious to her neighbors. Most dangerously, she often possessed some measure of autonomy. Widowhood, despite its hardships, could free individuals from direct male control in ways that marriage never did. Widows could own property, make business decisions, and speak freely in ways that married individuals could not. This independence was precisely what made them threatening to a social order built on subordination. The wise folk and midwives who had served their communities for generations found their traditional knowledge reinterpreted as evidence of diabolic conspiracy. The midwife who helped others through difficult labor was accused of causing those difficulties in the first place. Her knowledge of herbs that could ease pain or prevent conception was redefined as expertise in poisons and abortifacients. Her presence at births and deaths was seen as evidence that she controlled these natural processes through supernatural means. The transformation of healing knowledge into criminal evidence was particularly tragic because it destroyed traditions that had served generations for millennia. The village healer had been the repository of medical knowledge specifically related to reproductive and gynecological experience, pregnancy, childbirth, menstrual difficulties, menopause, contraception. This knowledge had been carefully preserved and transmitted across time, creating an informal network of expertise that complemented and sometimes competed with male-dominated medicine. Arcane prosecutions systematically dismantled this network. As folk healers were burned, their knowledge died with them. As healing practices were redefined as sorcery, others became afraid to learn or practice traditional remedies. The informal medical system that had long addressed reproductive needs was replaced by formal medicine dominated by university-trained men who often knew little about such specific health concerns. The economic dimensions of these purges also disproportionately affected females. In many communities, widows controlled significant property that they had inherited from their husbands. These assets made them attractive targets for confiscation proceedings that could fund further prosecutions. A wealthy individual charged with sorcery faced not only execution, but the seizure of property that might otherwise have passed to her children or relatives. The brewing and selling of ale, a traditional domestic occupation in many parts of Europe, came under particular suspicion. Those who brewed beer were often accused of using magical ingredients or supernatural assistance to improve their products. The competitive nature of the brewing trade meant that successful brewers inevitably had rivals who might benefit from accusations of maleficium. As male-dominated guilds began to take control of beer production, the independent brewsters who had dominated the trade found themselves increasingly vulnerable to supernatural charges. Marriage patterns also influenced vulnerability to arcane allegations. Those who never married were suspected of rejecting their natural role and therefore being available for diabolic seduction. Individuals who married multiple times, especially if their spouses died young, were suspected of using supernatural means to eliminate inconvenient partners. Those who remained childless were thought to have rejected motherhood in favor of serving Satan. Even individuals who bore many children could be accused of using diabolic assistance to ensure easy deliveries or healthy offspring. The interrogation techniques developed for arcane cases were specifically designed to exploit what prosecutors saw as feminine weaknesses. Suspects were considered more likely to confess under pressure, more susceptible to emotional manipulation, more prone to betraying accomplices to save themselves or their children. The use of torture was often calibrated differently for female defendants, with prosecutors believing that a lower tolerance for pain would make them confess more quickly. Sexual accusations formed a central part of many proceedings. reflecting deep anxieties about female sexuality that extended far beyond supernatural concerns. Those charged with sorcery were routinely accused of sexual congress with demons, participation in orgies at sabbats, and seduction of innocent individuals. These charges allowed prosecutors and audiences to explore sexual fantasies under the guise of religious investigation. The Sabbat, the supposed gathering where malefactors met to worship Satan, was described in explicitly sexual terms. Attendees were said to have intercourse with demons, participate in group sexual activities, and perform perverted rituals that combined sexuality with blasphemy. These descriptions were recorded in meticulous detail in hearing records, creating a pornographic literature disguised as legal documentation. The obsession with female sexuality in these hearings revealed the extent to which autonomy was seen as inherently dangerous. A person who controlled her own sexual activity was someone who might use that sexuality for diabolic purposes. The ideal Christian subject was chaste, obedient, and under male supervision. The sorceress represented everything that ideal was not: sexually active, independent, and allied with powers that challenged male authority. Children's testimony played a crucial role in many prosecutions, and this testimony often targeted caregivers, nurses, teachers, midwives, and neighborhood supporters. Children were considered particularly reliable witnesses because their innocence supposedly made them immune to supernatural deception. In practice, children's testimony was often shaped by adult questioners who led them toward the allegations prosecutors wanted to hear. The use of children as witnesses created a particularly cruel dynamic in which individuals who had devoted their lives to caring for the young found themselves condemned by those they had helped. Midwives who had delivered children were accused by those same children, now grown, of attempting to kill them at birth. Nurses who had cared for sick children were charged with causing their illnesses through supernatural means. The economic motivations behind arcane persecution were often disguised as moral or religious concerns, but the pattern of charges revealed their true nature. Communities under economic stress were more likely to experience purges. Individuals who profited from the campaign through confiscated property, professional fees, or enhanced authority were more likely to support continued prosecutions. The costs of the hearings were borne by the communities that hosted them, but the benefits often flowed to external authorities or local elites. Female property rights, such as they were, provided additional motives for allegations. An individual who inherited significant assets from a spouse or family became a target not only for the property itself, but for the independence that property represented. By charging such people with sorcery, communities could justify seizing assets while eliminating individuals whose very existence challenged traditional gender roles. The intersection of gender, property, and supernatural accusation was particularly visible in cases involving healers and merchants. Those who achieved economic success through their own efforts were especially vulnerable because their prosperity seemed to require explanation. If a person could not succeed through normal means, and social prejudices ensured that normal means were often closed to females, then diabolic assistance provided a convenient explanation for investigators and a justification for confiscation. Religious authority reinforced these patterns by providing theological justification for feminine subordination and punishment. Spirituality that operated outside official church channels was automatically suspect. Those who claimed direct religious experience, prophetic visions, or healing powers were challenging the male monopoly on religious authority. Even when such claims were initially accepted, they could easily be reinterpreted as diabolic deception if political circumstances changed. The cult of the Virgin Mary provided a paradoxical backdrop to supernatural purges. Mary represented ideal femininity, pure, obedient, devoted to serving God's will rather than her own desires. The malefactor represented her exact opposite, corrupt, rebellious, devoted to serving Satan's purposes. This theological framework made it impossible for females to claim a middle ground between sainthood and sorcery. Any individual who displayed independence, knowledge, or power beyond what was considered appropriate for their sex risked being classified as a servant of evil. As the crackdowns reached their peak in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, entire communities became convinced that they were under siege by armies of malevolent suspects. The stereotype of the malefactor as an older, independent, knowledgeable individual became so firmly established that accusation was almost automatic when misfortune struck. If crops failed, if children died, if livestock sickened, the first suspects were always those who fit the profile that centuries of terror had created. The systematic targeting of female individuals in arcane prosecutions represented more than simple prejudice or superstition. It was a coordinated assault on autonomy, knowledge, and authority that reshaped European society in fundamental ways. By destroying the wise folk who had preserved traditional knowledge, by criminalizing the healing practices that had served reproductive needs, by creating an atmosphere of suspicion around any person who displayed unusual knowledge or independence. The purges transformed gender relations in ways that would endure long after the cases themselves ended. The witch hunts transformed gender relations in ways that would endure long after the hearings themselves ended. But to understand how this transformation was accomplished, we must examine the machinery of allegation and prosecution that made it possible. Over the course of 2 centuries, European authorities refined the art of identifying, trying, and executing diabolic suspects into a deadly science that could destroy almost anyone unfortunate enough to fall under suspicion. The process typically began with a denunciation. Sometimes this came from a neighbor who blamed recent misfortunes on supernatural malice. Sometimes it emerged from the confession of someone already under interrogation, forced to name accomplices to ease their own suffering. Sometimes it arose from the testimony of children who were considered particularly reliable witnesses because their innocence supposedly protected them from demonic deception. Once a charge was made, the machinery of investigation swung into action with terrifying efficiency. Local authorities would examine the suspect's reputation, looking for signs of antisocial behavior that supposedly characterized spell workers. Had she quarreled with neighbors? Had she shown unusual anger when refused charity? Had misfortunes befallen those who crossed her? The normal conflicts and resentments of village life were transformed into indications of arcane malice. The physical examination of the defendant became a crucial part of the inquiry. Authorities searched for the devil's mark, any unusual spot, mole, or blemish that might indicate where Satan had touched his servant to seal their pact. What constituted such a mark was deliberately vague, ensuring that almost any physical characteristic could be interpreted as a sign of guilt. Birthmarks, scars, moles, or even places where repeated pricking failed to produce blood or pain could all be identified as occult signs. The search for devil's marks was performed by professional prickers who traveled from tribunal to tribunal with their specialized needles and expertise. These men commanded substantial fees for their services and had obvious incentives to find signs of guilt. They developed elaborate theories about where such marks were most likely to appear and what characteristics made them recognizably supernatural rather than natural. Water tests provided another supposed method for identifying malefactors. The charged individual would be bound and thrown into a river or pond under the theory that water, being pure and holy, would reject those who had made pacts with evil. If the suspect floated, they were deemed guilty and would be retrieved for execution. If they sank, they were innocent but would likely drown anyway. The water test was gradually abandoned in most jurisdictions, not because authorities recognized its futility, but because it was seen as forcing God to perform miracles on demand. Sleep deprivation emerged as one of the most effective techniques for breaking down resistance. Suspects would be kept awake for days at a time, with guards ensuring they could not rest even for moments. Exhausted prisoners became confused, suggestible, and desperate to end their torment through any means necessary. Many confessions extracted through sleep deprivation contained obvious impossibilities and contradictions, but these were usually ignored or explained away as signs of demonic influence. The formal interrogation process was designed to extract not just admissions, but detailed narratives that would satisfy popular expectations about arcane conspiracy. Suspects were questioned about their pacts with the devil, their attendance at sabbats, their methods of causing harm through maleficium. Leading questions guided them toward the specific details that prosecutors wanted to hear, creating remarkably consistent accounts across different regions and time periods. Coercion, when officially permitted, was supposed to be carefully regulated. Legal authorities developed elaborate rules about when it could be applied, how long it could continue, and what methods were acceptable. But these regulations were routinely ignored or circumvented by creative interpretations. Torture could be applied if there was sufficient proof of guilt, but the justification required was often nothing more than public suspicion or the testimony of other diabolic suspects. The strappado was among the most common coercive techniques used in these cases. The victim's hands were tied behind their back and attached to a rope that passed through a pulley in the ceiling. They would then be hoisted off the ground with their full body weight hanging from their arms twisted behind them. Weights might be attached to their feet to increase the agony. The pain was excruciating, and permanent damage to shoulders and arms was almost inevitable. Leg screws, thumb screws, and the rack were also commonly employed. These devices could be gradually tightened to increase pain, without necessarily causing immediate death. The psychological effect was often as important as the physical agony. Victims could see exactly what was being done to them, and understand that the pain would only increase until they provided the admissions their torturers demanded. The questioning during torture followed predictable patterns. Prosecutors had standard lists of questions about diabolic pacts, sabbat attendance, harmful enchantments, and the identities of accomplices. When victims provided answers that differed from expected narratives, they would be tortured further until their statements conformed to orthodox beliefs about maleficium. The requirement to name accomplices was particularly cruel because it forced victims to choose between continued suffering and condemning others to the same fate they were experiencing. Many initially resisted identifying others, but few could withstand prolonged agony. The admissions thus extracted created expanding circles of allegation that could consume entire communities if authorities chose to pursue every lead. Spectral testimony presented special challenges for tribunals trying to maintain some semblance of legal procedure. This was evidence about what witnesses claimed to see in dreams, visions, or supernatural encounters. The accused supposedly appeared to them in spirit form to cause harm or demand their allegiance to Satan. Since only the witness could see these spectral appearances, there was no way to verify or contradict such claims, making it extremely difficult for the accused to defend themselves. The acceptance of spectral claims varied by jurisdiction and time period. Some tribunals embraced it enthusiastically as proof of occult crime. Others rejected it as inherently unreliable, since demons might impersonate innocent people to cause false charges. The debate over spectral accounts became one of the key factors in the eventual decline of these hearings, as legal authorities became increasingly uncomfortable with material that could not be independently verified. Children's statements were given extraordinary weight in maleficium cases, despite legal traditions that typically viewed young witnesses with suspicion. The supposed innocence of children was thought to protect them from demonic deception, making their accounts of supernatural events particularly reliable. In practice, children's statements were often coached by adults who provided them with detailed narratives about sorcery and encouraged them to identify community members as enemies of the faith. The most famous example of children's accounts devastating entire communities occurred in Salem, Massachusetts, but similar patterns appeared throughout Europe. Young accusers seemed to enjoy the attention and power that their testimony provided, while adults encouraged them to continue making denunciations that confirmed existing suspicions and fears. Property confiscation became an integral part of these cases, providing both motivation for continued prosecutions and funding for the expensive legal machinery. The possessions of convicted spell workers were typically seized to pay for the costs of their hearings, including fees for judges, prosecutors, torturers, and executioners. Wealthy suspects were particularly attractive targets because their assets could fund multiple additional proceedings. The economic incentives created by property confiscation corrupted the entire judicial process. Courts had financial interests in convicting the defendants rather than protecting their rights. Professional pursuers of arcane criminals could guarantee their continued employment by ensuring steady streams of convictions that would generate funds for future investigations. Local authorities could use these prosecutions to eliminate inconvenient individuals while enriching themselves through seized assets. Professional executioners developed specialized expertise in dispatching large numbers of condemned suspects efficiently. They experimented with different methods to maximize the propaganda value of public executions while minimizing costs and delays. Some became celebrities in their own right, traveling from jurisdiction to conduct mass burnings that drew crowds from throughout the surrounding region. The execution sites themselves became theaters of moral instruction, where authorities could demonstrate their vigilance against arcane threats. Detailed sermons explained the crimes of the condemned and warned audiences about the dangers of falling into similar sins. The suffering of the accused was presented as just punishment for their rebellion against God and society. Public executions served multiple purposes beyond simple retribution. They provided entertainment for populations that had few other diversions. They reinforced social hierarchies by demonstrating what happened to those who challenged established authority. They created shared experiences that bound communities together in opposition to enemies said to be lurking within. The psychological impact of witnessing mass executions was profound and lasting. Entire generations grew up believing that their communities were under constant siege by hidden malefactors who could strike at any moment. The fear of indictment became a powerful force for social conformity, discouraging any behavior that might seem unusual or threatening to nervous neighbors. Record keeping became increasingly sophisticated as authorities developed bureaucratic systems for processing large numbers of cases efficiently. Tribunals maintained detailed files on allegations, confessions, asset seizures, and executions. These records were sometimes shared between jurisdictions, creating regional databases of arcane suspects and their alleged methods. The standardization of procedures across different jurisdictions was facilitated by the circulation of legal manuals, hearing transcripts, and scholarly treatises on sorcery. Judges could learn from their colleagues' experiences, adopting successful techniques and avoiding methods that had proven ineffective. The campaign against occultism became a collaborative enterprise involving legal experts, theologians, and administrators throughout Europe. By the early 17th century, the machinery of arcane prosecutions had achieved a terrible perfection. But even as European authorities refined their techniques for identifying and destroying preternatural enemies, the panic was crossing the Atlantic Ocean, carried by religious settlers whose rigid theology and isolated circumstances would create the perfect conditions for one final, spectacular outbreak of persecution. The English colonization of North America brought with it all the religious tensions and occult fears that had convulsed Europe for over 2 centuries. The Calvinist reformers who settled New England were particularly susceptible to panic because their theology emphasized the constant struggle between good and evil. Their communities were small and claustrophobic, and their isolation from established authority left them vulnerable to local hysteria. The first arcane hearings in colonial America began almost as soon as the settlements were established. In 1647, Alce Young was hanged in Windsor, Connecticut, becoming the first person executed for maleficium in the New World. Over the next 45 years, scattered cases throughout New England claimed the lives of dozens of charged spell workers, establishing legal precedents and popular beliefs that would culminate in the most infamous episode in American history. Connecticut proved particularly active in prosecuting supernatural suspects during the 1650s and 1660s. The colony executed at least 11 individuals, including several married couples accused of practicing occult crimes together. These early proceedings established many of the patterns that would later appear in the 1692 crisis. Allegations arising from neighborhood disputes, the targeting of unpopular or unconventional women, and the use of visionary testimony to prove diabolic offenses. The Hartford Panic of 1662 to 1663 demonstrated how quickly charges could spread in tightly knit New England communities. What began with the claims of a young girl named Anne Cole eventually implicated dozens of people throughout the Connecticut River Valley. Cole claimed to be possessed by demons who spoke through her in different voices, revealing the names of local spell workers and describing their uncanny crimes in lurid detail. These hearings introduced several innovations that would later prove influential. They featured some of the earliest American use of touch tests, where accusers would supposedly be relieved of diabolic torment by touching the person who had enchanted them. They also saw extensive use of confessions obtained through psychological pressure rather than physical coercion, as New England theology emphasized the importance of voluntary admission of guilt. Virginia's approach to occult allegations proved markedly different. The Southern colony's Anglican establishment was more skeptical of uncanny claims, and its legal system provided stronger protections for the charged. Most Virginia cases ended in acquittal or dismissal, with accusers sometimes being punished for making false charges. The contrast between Virginia's restraint and New England's fervor highlighted how local religious and legal cultures shaped responses to diabolic suspicions. The Caribbean colonies presented their own unique challenges to European traditions. The presence of large enslaved African populations brought different spiritual traditions into contact with Christian beliefs about evil. Enslaved people's knowledge of herbal medicine, healing rituals, and spiritual practices was often interpreted by white colonists as evidence of spellcraft, creating additional layers of racial and cultural conflict within the broader framework of persecution. In Barbados and other sugar islands, charges often reflected tensions between plantation owners and enslaved workers. Enslaved individuals who practiced traditional healing or spiritual rituals could find themselves accused of harming their masters or fellow slaves. The power dynamics of slavery meant that such allegations were particularly dangerous, as the accused had no legal protections and their owners had economic incentives to eliminate troublemakers through arcane charges. But it was in the New England village, at the heart of the 1692 panic, that the outbreak would reach its greatest intensity and achieve its most lasting notoriety. The diabolic scare in that community represented both the culmination of 2 centuries of European tradition and the beginning of its end. What happened there would become the most studied and remembered prosecution in history, largely because it would be among the last. The crisis began in the winter of 1691 to 1692 in the household of the village minister Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter Elizabeth and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began experiencing strange fits, screaming, throwing themselves about, complaining of being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. A local doctor, unable to find physical causes for their symptoms, suggested occult influences might be at work. Under pressure from concerned adults, the girls eventually named 3 individuals as their tormentors. Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household who came from Barbados. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who survived on charity. And Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had scandalized the community by living with a man before marrying him. All 3 fit the traditional profile of the malefactor, marginalized individuals with little social standing or protection. The choice of these first 3 suspects was not accidental. Tituba represented the exotic and dangerous influences that colonists associated with the wider Atlantic world. Her knowledge of Caribbean spiritual practices and her race made her an obvious target for preternatural suspicions. Sarah Good embodied the threatening figure of the undeserving poor, whose resentment at being refused charity might manifest in uncanny revenge. Sarah Osborne represented sexual transgression and social unconventionality that challenged moral standards. The initial examinations of the named suspects, conducted by local magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, followed procedures that had been developed over centuries of European diabolic prosecutions. The magistrates assumed guilt and structured their questions to extract admissions rather than determine innocence. Apparitional proof was accepted without question. If the afflicted girls claimed to see the spirits of the charged tormenting them, this was considered sufficient to justify conviction. Tituba's confession proved crucial in transforming a local incident into a major crisis. Whether through fear, calculated survival strategy, or belief in the spiritual world described by her questioners, she provided detailed testimony about making pacts with the devil, attending enchanted meetings, and conspiring with others to harm the colony. Her confession validated the magistrate's worst fears and suggested the village was under attack by an organized conspiracy of uncanny enemies. The spreading panic was fueled by several factors unique to the community's circumstances. The settlement was deeply divided by factional disputes over land, clerical authority, and economic development. Families that had been feuding for years found new ways to attack their enemies through spiritual allegations. The Putnam family, which was closely allied with Minister Parris, became particularly active in promoting denunciations against their rivals. The afflicted girls discovered that their charges gave them unprecedented power and attention in a society that normally silenced youth. They could command the immediate attention of magistrates, ministers, and entire communities. They could destroy adults who had previously ignored them. The intoxicating nature of this power encouraged them to make increasingly dramatic charges against higher status individuals. As news of the panic spread throughout Massachusetts, other communities began experiencing their own outbreaks of spiritual affliction. Young women in Andover, Ipswich, and other towns began claiming they too were being tormented by local spell workers. The hysteria seemed to spread like a contagious disease, jumping from community to community wherever conditions were right for uncanny fears to take hold. The colonial authorities initially supported the village proceedings enthusiastically. Governor William Phips established a special tribunal of Oyer and Terminer to handle the growing caseload. The tribunal was headed by William Stoughton, a Harvard-educated minister and judge who believed deeply in the reality of the occult threat facing the colony. Stoughton and his fellow justices accepted all the evidentiary practices that had been developed during earlier persecutions. They admitted apparitional proof, touch tests, and confessions obtained through psychological pressure. They allowed the afflicted girls to interrupt proceedings with dramatic displays of spiritual torment. They treated denial of guilt as evidence of continued allegiance to the devil and admission as proof of redemption. The prosecutions moved with terrifying speed through the summer of 1692. Bridget Bishop, a tavern keeper with a reputation for unconventional behavior, became the first person executed on June 10th. 5 more were hanged on July 19th, including Rebecca Nurse, an elderly and previously respected church member whose conviction shocked many. 5 more died on August 19th, and 8 more on September 22nd, including Martha Corey and Mary Easty. The village proceedings differed from earlier European cases in several ways. They occurred much later than the peak persecutions, at a time when skeptical attitudes were already emerging. They took place in communities with strong traditions of written record-keeping, leaving behind documentation that would later be scrutinized by historians. Most importantly, they occurred within the broader context of Enlightenment, thinking that was beginning to question traditional beliefs about arcane causation. The opposition began almost immediately, led by clergy and magistrates who questioned whether the material being used was sufficient to justify executions. Increase Mather, one of the region's most respected religious authorities, published Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits in October 1692, arguing that apparitional evidence was too unreliable to support capital convictions. His son, Cotton Mather, despite earlier support, began expressing private doubts. The turning point came when the charges began targeting people whose guilt seemed impossible to believe. When the afflicted girls denounced Lady Mary Phips, the governor's wife, even the most credulous observers began to question whether things had gone too far. Similar doubts arose when prominent ministers and magistrates came under suspicion. Governor Phips, responding to mounting criticism and perhaps concerned for his wife's safety, began restricting the tribunal of Oyer and Terminer's activities in October 1692. He forbade further arrests without his personal approval and eventually dissolved the special court entirely. When a new tribunal was established, it rejected apparitional proof and quickly acquitted most of the remaining suspects. The 1692 panic officially ended in May 1693, when Phips pardoned all remaining charged individuals. In total, the crisis resulted in the deaths of 20 people, 14 females and 6 males executed by hanging, plus Giles Corey, who was pressed to death for refusing to enter a plea. At least 5 more died in prison while awaiting hearing. The aftermath proved as significant as the panic itself. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, publicly apologized for his role. 12 jurors signed a statement acknowledging their error and asking forgiveness. The General Court of the colony eventually passed legislation providing compensation to the families of the victims. But perhaps most importantly, the 1,692 events mark the beginning of the end for occult persecution in the English-speaking world. The combination of their late timing, extensive documentation, and ultimate repudiation created a powerful cautionary tale. Legal systems became more skeptical of such charges, religious authorities more cautious, and popular culture began to view these prosecutions as dangerous fanaticism rather than justice. The episode also demonstrated how arcane allegations could serve as weapons in community conflicts. The factional disputes that divided the village found expression through spiritual charges, but the underlying conflicts were about land, power, and social change. The occult framework provided a vocabulary for expressing anxieties that were fundamentally secular. The rapid spread and equally rapid collapse illustrated both the power and fragility of arcane beliefs. Under the right circumstances, charges could still consume entire communities. But the same intellectual and social changes that were ending European persecutions were also at work in colonial America, making it increasingly difficult to sustain belief in widespread preternatural conspiracy. As news of the events spread back to Europe, they provided additional ammunition for critics. The spectacle of educated ministers and magistrates condemning obviously innocent people on the basis of apparitional claims seemed to confirm the worst fears of skeptics. The 1692 panic became a cautionary tale, not just for Americans, but for Europeans already questioning the wisdom of continued occult persecution. The panic had crossed the Atlantic, but it would not survive the crossing back. The Age of Fire was finally drawing to a close. Throughout the 18th century, a combination of intellectual, legal, and social changes would gradually extinguish the flames that had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives across 2.5 centuries of European history. The Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking about causation, testimony, and human nature that were fundamentally incompatible with traditional beliefs in magic working. Philosophers, like Voltaire, ridiculed occult explanations for natural phenomena, arguing that what previous generations had attributed to sorcery could be better explained through scientific observation and rational analysis. David Hume questioned whether miraculous events were even theoretically possible, suggesting that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, something inquisitorial proceedings had never delivered. The emerging scientific methods offered alternative explanations for many phenomena, once blamed on arcane forces. Medical knowledge was advancing rapidly, providing natural explanations for diseases and conditions previously seen as uncanny. Weather patterns were beginning to be understood through atmospheric science rather than preternatural intervention. Agricultural failures could be traced to soil conditions, pest infestations, and climate variation rather than diabolic curses. Legal systems were also evolving in ways that made occult prosecutions increasingly difficult to sustain. The modern concept of burden of proof placed responsibility on prosecutors to demonstrate guilt rather than on defendants to prove innocence. Rules of evidence became more stringent, excluding testimony that could not be verified. The use of torture was gradually restricted and eventually eliminated in most jurisdictions, making it impossible to obtain the confessions that had underpinned centuries of arcane proceedings. Professional legal training created a class of judges and attorneys who applied systematic approaches to testimony and procedure. These professionals were generally more skeptical of magic-related charges than the local magistrates and clerics who had previously dominated these cases. They understood the importance of due process and were less inclined to abandon legal protections in pursuit of alleged diabolic suspects. Economic transformations also played a role. As European societies became more commercially connected and economically diversified, the local grievances that fueled many denunciations became less central to public life. Property rights became more secure and transparent, making it harder to use arcane allegations as pretexts for seizure. Religious authority was fragmenting, complicating any coordinated response to suspected occult threats. The spread of Protestant denominations created competing spiritual doctrines, while religious toleration gradually expanded. This allowed for diversity in belief systems that might previously have been condemned as magic working. Declining belief in diabolic pacts and enchanted maleficium proved crucial. As educated elites questioned whether arcane agents truly possessed uncanny powers, the theological rationale for purges began to crumble. If spell workers wielded no real influence, there was no urgent need to seek them out and destroy them. Popular culture began shifting away from mystical explanations for misfortune. The rise of newspapers and printed literature introduced new forms of entertainment that competed with the dramatic spectacles of past purges. Scientific ideas were increasingly shared through books and public lectures. Urban populations grew more skeptical of folk beliefs and mystical attributions. The last executions for magic working in Europe occurred sporadically. France ended its final burnings in the 1680s, when the Parliament of Paris began overturning death sentences. England's last hanging took place in 1684, though the death penalty was not formally abolished until 1736. Scotland persisted slightly longer, with the final execution occurring in 1727, when Janet Horne was condemned for allegedly transforming her daughter into a pony. The absurdity of this case became emblematic of how irrational such procedures had become. Germany, once a centre of diabolic prosecutions, saw its last executions in the 1750s. The Holy Roman Empire's fragmented political landscape allowed some territories to continue crackdowns long after others had embraced reform. The contrast between progressive and traditional regions highlighted how local factors often determined whether terror persisted. Switzerland witnessed Europe's last execution for occult crime in 1782, when Anna Goldie was beheaded for supposedly poisoning a child through magical means. Her case was controversial, with many questioning whether the claims justified her death. Poland's last burning came in 1793, during a period of political disarray, underscoring how disconnected from reason such acts had become. It marked the symbolic end of Europe's long reign of fear. But the transformation was not limited to the cessation of executions. Societies began actively rejecting the worldview that had once made purges seem necessary. Sorcery was reclassified from active menace to cultural curiosity, from capital crime to an emblem of past ignorance. Literature played a key role. Shakespeare's witches in Macbeth became theatrical devices rather than community threats. Folk tales recast them as fantasy characters, no longer real-world criminals. The medicalization of previously arcane phenomena greatly reduced belief in uncanny forces. Conditions like epilepsy and mental illness were increasingly understood through neurological science. Physicians replaced ministers as the go-to authorities for unusual behavior. Social changes helped protect those who had historically been most vulnerable. Though far from equal, women were gaining modest legal rights and economic roles that reduced their reliance on traditions once labeled sorcery. Folk healers and midwives began to disappear, replaced by formally trained medical men. Education spread, literacy improved, scientific works became accessible to growing audiences. Books and pamphlets nurtured skeptical mindsets, eroding public trust in mystical explanations. Still, while formal prosecutions ceased, the underlying patterns of blame and marginalization persisted in new forms. The psychological dynamics that sustained the terror, attributing hardship to malevolent agents, believing fantastic allegations, turning communities against their own, remain deeply human. In many parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, modern purges based on occult claims continue. Without strong legal institutions or widespread scientific literacy, the same destructive forces re-emerge. Denunciations target the poor, the elderly, and the socially isolated. In sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in Nigeria, Ghana, and Tanzania, thousands are killed each year in arcane purges. These campaigns often erupt during economic distress or disease outbreaks, scapegoating the vulnerable in efforts to explain misfortune. India experiences similar atrocities. In rural regions with weak courts, women accused of folk sorcery are beaten, tortured, or murdered. The accused are typically marginalized and unprotected. Papua New Guinea also faces violent episodes. Accusations of sorcery have led to horrific acts, fueled by cultural stress and limited state intervention. Even in developed nations, elements of the same psychology persist. Moral panics like the satanic ritual abuse scare of the 1980s mimicked historical patterns, relying on coerced testimony, targeting the unpopular, and feeding mass suspicion. The McMartin preschool case exemplified this. Despite a total lack of credible evidence, families were ruined and millions spent prosecuting supposed occult crimes based on stories from coached children. Modern political crackdowns also reflect historical dynamics. The phrase witch hunt has become shorthand for politicized accusations based on flimsy evidence. McCarthyism echoed past terrors, demanding confession, punishing association, and destroying lives on suspicion alone. Meanwhile, feminist thinkers began to reclaim the figure of the maligned healer. From the 1960s onward, scholars and activists reframed past crackdowns as patriarchal assaults on female autonomy. The arcane suspect became a symbol of resistance. The wise women and midwives once hunted were reimagined as protectors of knowledge, independence, and dignity. Their demise, seen through this lens, marked the forced transfer of power from female community leaders to male-dominated institutions. Neo-pagan and Wiccan movements further transformed this legacy. Rejecting Christian demonization, they embraced arcane symbolism as spiritual empowerment. The figure once feared became one of healing and identity. Wiccans often honor the memory of past victims, viewing their practice as a revival of ancient, persecuted traditions. Though historically debatable, this narrative has proven deeply meaningful for many. The idea of a witch hunt also gained metaphorical power in academia. Scholars analyzing genocide, repression, and communal violence draw parallels to earlier purges, illustrating how group fears manifest in institutional cruelty. Understanding the dynamics of historic campaigns against supposed magic workers offers insight into present-day hysteria. The psychological mechanisms, fear, projection, scapegoating, remain. Legal protections created in response to arcane prosecutions, rules of evidence, rights of the accused, due process, are now cornerstones of justice. The bitter lessons of history shape the safeguards of modern law. As we reflect on the centuries of diabolic allegations that reshaped Europe and America, we must honor how far we've come and recognize how easily fear can return. The flames that consumed tens of thousands have died, but their lessons endure. In an age of rising division and moral panic, their story reminds us how thin the line can be between justice and hysteria. Those maligned healers, those condemned spell workers are no longer seen as monsters. Their wisdom, once buried under fire and shame, is being rediscovered. Their pain, long ignored, is now part of our collective reckoning. The purge has ended, but its echoes remain, and with them the warning. Never forget how quickly fear can destroy, and how urgently reason must defend the light against the return of darkness.